Hi, this is the episode of the Buryan podcast dedicated to nuclear colonialism and the multiple ways it influences lands, bodies, memories, spaces, and times. Today there are two moderators, Yivha Zban, a Ukrainian-born decolonial activist and artist, and me, Lilia Yuldasheva, a decolonial researcher and cultural worker interested in feminist and queer politics. Our guest today is Svitlana Matviyenko, a scholar whose research and teaching are focused on information and cyberwar, media and environment, infrastructure studies, digital militarism, practices of resistance, and nuclear cultures, including the Chornobyl Zone of Exclusion. When we were planning this episode, we thought that the topics of nuclear colonialism, in particular Soviet nuclear politics and Russian nuclear terrorism, would be at the center of our conversation. But eventually it went further and included other trajectories, catching the multiplicity of the scales and dimensions of colonialism. So we also speak about how it affects matter, land, air, water, plants, bodies, and various aspects of human and non-human lives, such as temporalities, imaginations, emotions, and futures. I think we should start from our first question, which seems to be a bit introductory. And we want to ask you to talk about the terms which we will be using and discuss further. And of course, the main terms for now are cyber war and nuclear war and cyber terrorism and nuclear terrorism. And maybe talk about your previous research and how it's going now.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Just for the context, of course, we probably need to define those terms, because the term cyber war, in a way how me and my co-author Nick Dyer-Witherford use it in our book, is very different from how this term is used by, let's say, military specialists or security specialists in the States at that time when we were writing this, but also elsewhere, and especially in Ukraine today. So usually in military and security discourses, and especially a couple of years ago, it was very much about hacking, leaking, everything digital, right? So cyber war was almost imagined as belonging to the entire digital domain, whatever it was. That was the reason why this domain had to be accepted. It had to enter the discourse and practices of warfare. And that's why, I think it was around 2009, 2010, if I'm correct about that, United States Cybersecurity Command added cyberspace as one of the domains of war, along with land, sea, etc. After this, it became a kind of official domain, which means that certain techniques, tools, practices, institution, offices, specialists, experts, etc., is suddenly concretized as united military assemblage. So certain things were happening before that. The acceptance of cyberspace as an official war domain solidified that. And then after this, for them, cyber war appeared as this thing belonging to cyber domain. However, they also acknowledged that it's not totally disconnected, just like any digital systems, from other domains. There were ways in which they intersect. Later, after Snowden's leaks, there were more interesting things revealed through the NSA documents, where we saw that those military and security specialists really thought through the connections between digital and other layers of this huge military assemblage, right? So they thought about how all platforms and things on the ground are linked, how signal goes, what is the user behavior. So in a certain way, it became clear after that leak that cyberwar does not really belong to that domain. And these links to other domains of war are not an extension of that. Maybe on these links and on these routes, cyberwar actually happens. Maybe cyberwar itself is the links between all these different domains, sea and land and space and whatnot. It was very much similar to how anything cyber was imagined in this early internet era when people like William Gibson were thinking, "What? Where is cyberspace?" And one of the sci-fi writers at that time said, like, cyberspace exists between the phones. So what cyberspace is still between the phones, but it's not a vacuum. It's actually the space of all these material linkages of the signal, of affect, of other materialities, etc. And cyberwar is, in fact, is a connector. And this connector, or this material space where certain transactions and transitions are happening, is the space of war. And what I'm now describing is already beyond how military and security specialists actually understood it. It's already more close to how Nick and I started speaking about it. We were actually looking at all those interlinking materialities and connections and power relations that would emerge or that would be mobilized in this very complex material space of connections. And we also looked at the political economy that was in making in this space that was erroneously thought by many as empty, but it wasn't. And when we started speaking about, again, all this power and political economic relations, we understood what this complexity as cyberwar. Yeah, it's a long answer. And of course, it is even more complex. So there are different ways to talk about this, but let us work with this one, at least in this conversation. Yeah.
During your answer, I was thinking about the importance of this topic of connections and how for some feminist researchers, connection seems to be some positive thing. And a lot of hopes are put in this idea of interconnectedness. But I think there is other side of connections, which can be called dark side. What do you think about this? And maybe the difference between this utopian dimension of connections and interconnectedness is linked to the openness and transparency of these connections, and this dark side more close to the power to hide connections and how they're used.
The question of connections is very important, and I agree with you that it would be problematic to characterize them only just good and bad or etc., right? So both existence and non-existence of connections can be problematic or can be a solution for something. But one work that inspired me to think about connections was the work by Yaris Victor Grove, Savage Ecologies. It's a book that speaks a lot about war, but also colonialism, coloniality, and modernity. And it speaks about war as an important event of modernity, and not just an event. We could almost say a technology invention of modernity. In a certain way, you would come with him to a conclusion that modernity doesn't exist without war. So it expands it, it makes progress by means of militarization and war, which means that the war is a crucial thing in modernity. For modernity, it's not an exception, it's what modernity is. And in this book, he speaks about different types of assemblages, and assemblages are connected entities. So there are some assemblages that, let's say, support life, peace or peaceful assemblages, and there are other assemblages that are destructive, martial assemblages. And he speaks about coexistence or substitution of one assemblages by other assemblages. So in a certain way, to see what war is or how it begins, even if there is no obvious intervention. You could almost, quote unquote, measure it by the quantity or the presence of martial or militant assemblages. If you recognize certain combination or connection between certain things as militant, and if you see what these units can be identified as related to war, even if there was no visible intervention, it's already war. If it makes sound as a duck, it moves as a duck, it's most likely a duck. In fact, it's a very important thing because it helps us to think such a problematic phenomenon as proxy or undeclared war, which is also a modern invention. In a certain way, we could say that the wars that were openly declared belong to different epochs. Хтось там йшов на «ви», declare war. We don't live like this. The wars that were declared are exceptions. And then there were massive amount of wars where someone was saying that it's not us, we are not there, it's a special operation. But you can see it, you can capture it, you can measure it by noticing the formation of these militant assemblages, how they substitute life-supporting assemblages, peaceful assemblages, and how they substitute or change the regime of being. So that's why, for me, the idea of connections and assemblages and relations between things is very much important. It allows me to talk and to think about this type of wars that we still do not sometimes recognize as wars, even in military theory. Of course, there are so many specialists who study wars, who can tell you a ton of things about some complex technologies. Their expertise is deep and amazing. But if you think about how these people, so knowledgeable about war, history, and theory, would be extremely traditional in terms of thinking about the beginning of the war or the end of the war, or what is war or what is not war, and what is civil war, right? So what these things remain kind of almost deadlocks from my encounter with military theory, because I had to use a lot of sources and read a lot of sources trying to define cyberwar and think about cyberwar, right? So, but I noticed this very strange traditionalism in terms of understanding of these crucial moments and misrecognition of this very important change that happened maybe 100 years ago in modernity, in terms of wars that begin almost from nowhere.
This leads us to the second part of the question about the nuclear infrastructure, because it seems to be like the perfect example of unrecognizable boundaries or hidden boundaries between peaceful and military.
Yes, this is one of the core observations that comes from lots of writers and researchers who work with anything nuclear. The nuclear does have this double nature, and it has to do with being one foot on something military and one on something peaceful, right? So in this double nature, nuclear is a symptomatic phenomenon of modernity. And something that tells us most about what modernity is, it's this intersection of anything civilian and anything military. And the fact that all major nuclear power plants in the world were engaged both with the military and with civilian. It was in the UK, it was in the USSR, it was in the States, everywhere, right? So there was a long time when no government would acknowledge that and would never speak about it openly. But it was almost clear, it was almost open secret everywhere. And if we speak about the Chornobyl nuclear power plant, definitely that open secret is very open for anyone who worked there. And that's why probably we have this wonderful story about this slogan about peaceful atom that was set on one of the building roofs in Pripyat, "Хай буде атом робітником, а не солдатом," when at some point "Хай" was turned into "Hui." And we know that it was recognition of this knowledge, of this open secret, that we know that it's not a fully peaceful atom, that we also produced military-grade plutonium here. So that's the double nature again. It's modernity as such, being on the side of peace and being on the side of war, and mixing them together.
Thank you. Maybe we could also speak about how Russia now uses this Soviet infrastructure, so-called peaceful atom and nuclear power plants, as one of the tools for terrorist attacks and terrorizing not only Ukraine, but also I think it's using it as a message for the whole world. And what features of this infrastructure let Russia do this actually?
Here we can speculate, of course, but I have some interpretations why and how we can understand that. Of course, we are talking here about weaponization of nuclear power infrastructure, even if there was some activity and some open secret and some engagement in the military productions and whatnot. Now it serves civilians. But with this dark secret of recent past, it kind of is mobilized in a certain way or comes back as a certain strategy, as a certain vision of what to do, how to use it as a weapon. And in the war, like the one we have now of the Russian Federation and Ukraine, I hear people calling it a total war. It's a complex term, and I still wouldn't use it, because what we observe now is also a very interesting, complex coexistence of war and peace in Ukraine. There are these islands that function like there is no war. People go to the cinema, watch Barbie, people go to the restaurants, etc. And some hours it feels like peace, and then bam, there is a ballistic rocket. And then you kind of reminded that it's not. This coexistence and fluctuation of certain war regimes and some other regimes that remind of peace already tells us, because when we think about total war, it's complete militarization of every inch. And here we have a really confusing, for some outsiders, reality. Some people come to Ukraine and see a peaceful day in Kyiv, say like, this is so strange, where is your war? And then you realize that they just missed drone attack by one day, and they suddenly arrived just in this one little day when there was no attacks, right? So, and then there are like a week of complete drone attacks and ballistic rockets. But we see one of the things that the notion of total war gave us is a possibility to weaponize almost anything. When we call something total war, that's when we speak about total militarization and weaponization of everything. And with this principle, actually, even though I don't call the Ukraine situation total war, but we can see how at the same time, in this complex coexistence and the possibility for war to enter any dimension of life, even very far from front lines. We saw so many hits to, for example, Western Ukraine, specific attention to Lviv, and most recently Khmelnytsky region, because there is still, again, another nuclear power plant there. So war appears anywhere, at any moment. Even just now, things look like peace. And war is there within the speed of ballistic rocket. And anything can be also weaponized. Information can be weaponized, certain leaks can be weaponized, certain scientific works can be also weaponized. So that's why when you even talk about different problems, you kind of think how to say it so that Solovyov doesn't bring it on his stupid show. So how to say a complex thing, some critique or something else, a certain observation that wouldn't be made a weapon immediately on Russian TV, right? So, and then again, there is such an easily weaponizable structure as the nuclear power infrastructure, which contains a real danger given physical and chemical characteristics of worked fuel or not worked fuel or whatever it is in its entirety, but also it has an informational, affective sense attached to it, and which reminds me very much of work of one American scholar, Gabrielle Hecht, who writes about nuclear power infrastructures in different countries. And she has a wonderful article which is called A Power of Things Nuclear. So just the fact, whatever nuclear it is, even if it's a container for the future nuclear something, the fact that it's somehow already related makes it almost radioactive immediately, right? So there is some power, and it's definitely, perception, it's definitely certain epistemology, and etc., etc. This power of things nuclear sometimes has nothing to do with physical or chemical. It has to do with that. So a nuclear power infrastructure is the object that is weaponizable in all these dimensions. So when you speak with Ukrainian experts and ask them to evaluate the risks of some hit or explosion somewhere around Zaporizhia, they actually, if they're real experts, they wouldn't be so paranoid as many other experts. They would tell you, well, Zaporizhia is pretty protected structure. It was built to survive a strong rocket hit or this or that, right? But then nuclear also has with this dimension that this knowledge doesn't really save you. You still don't know. There is so much we don't know. But what if there is some reaction and some power wave or something else would initiate something else? We don't know, right? So with nuclear has a lot of things, a lot of concerns attached to it that has to do with something that we don't know. And of course, it's a legacy of Chernobyl and what we knew and what we didn't know about this, right? So all this certainty that was attached to RMBK reactors that were not supposed to explode. And when you think about that knowledge, which we now know wasn't accurate because there were some cases of explosion before, but they were hidden. So that's how we inherited this extreme worry and the sense that there is unknown around it, right? So there is a power of nuclear things, then there is something unknown. There are lots of risks attached, and you in the end do not know where, in fact, someone can position that explosives and this bomb or whatever it is, right? So what if they put it somewhere, I don't know. So anyway, we can see how easy to weaponize it if in the symbolic realm and in the physical scientific realm, there are still so many unknown things. What is unknown is easily weaponizable. Again, to return to the notion of cyberwar, right? So in addition to physicality of leaks and breaks, so it has a lot to do with affects, knowledge, with perception, right? So, and certain things are used or are weaponized just on the basis of that.
Yeah, can I ask about the unknown parts and about the speculation on the unknown? Nuclear power plant in Zaporizhia now is occupied by Russian army. There are, for example, pictures, images of some explosives that were put on the roof. So it's a kind of, the word that actually wasn't pronounced was the terrorism. I just wanted to link those lacunes of unknown and the speculation on them and the creation of the spectacles to actually create this theater of terrorism and the power of the nuclear. And it's actually really powerful, even though some experts, as you say, who actually work at the power plants say, well, the power plant is actually protected. The things that we do not know create this superpower of manipulation and terror, and it helps Russia Federation to manipulate the military help and connections of Ukraine to other countries who could help, that partners can be afraid of Russian terrorism, which can actually, if we remember the Chornobyl, it will affect anything.
Yeah, you are absolutely right. The unknown is the best weapon. On the basis of the unknown, lots of processes of this war unfold. And what I mean is, if we even think about the invasion itself, many people in Ukraine say that they knew that it would happen. I belong to that group who says that I didn't know, or rather, I thought that it would not happen because it was against the logic of survival for Russia itself. Because for me, it was clear that the invasion would just hurt Russia so much that it just doesn't make sense. They just wouldn't do it because of that. If we call that illogical, because there are, of course, other logics here, right? So here we speak about survival logic for the country. So I thought that primarily logic at play would be the survival for the country, for Russia itself, to continue its imperial colonial existence, continue be what it is, continue being that, blah, blah, right? So, but no, this logic didn't work.
But there are other logics like invasion in Sakartvelo, occupation of Chechnya.
Exactly. Really, colonial logic probably works almost against the survival logic. Colonial logic is the logic of expansion, right? So in a certain way, and we can probably speak about other logics, right? There is certain economy, politics, and this, and different regimes. And there is also some kind of paranoid logic. These things kind of almost constitute their own layers of reality. And you look at reality according to certain logic and you say, no, they will not do it because it's going to be crash for Russia. But Russia suddenly works along with colonial logic.
Yeah, but Russia had, for example, the special committee with NATO, the special committee, the special relations. So it actually has something to do with this hybrid image of Russia that at the same time colonial and acts as colonial, and it's also act like a scarecrow somehow, but at the same time it has some other dimension, and people maybe choose to
see some part of it. And what we are talking now, it's about the fact that we often speak about Russia as even something united, unified, but it's not. So there are Russias. So there are many things. And again, what is Russia, right? So what does it begin, where it ends? There is something that we call federation, so which already indicates a multiplicity of something, right? So is it a particular regime that actually spread everywhere else? Like, is Russia, is that regime that spread everywhere until Kamchatka or whatever, right? So is that regime, is that Russia? Or is that the kind of a system of privileges, right? So what is Russia? And then there is this power apparatus. I'm not an expert here. I'm actually someone who has more questions at this moment, and I'm looking for language. I'm looking for the ways to understand it. And what I'm saying now, I immediately admit that I'm just speculating alone with all of you now. So we are thinking together to understand this very complex event and its potential consequences, etc. But again, what these logics also constitute a certain multiplicity, and you do not know which of them would be used at certain moment, right? So what if next gesture would be very much against survival logic? And whenever you think they would do or wouldn't do something, so would they actually put the explosives under waste fuel container and how strong and what it would be, right? So, and who would do this? And that was cyberwar is about. We are in the realm of chaos. But this chaos is an interesting invention, right? So even conventional wars would employ deception and this and that. But the level that it went with cyber wars, with the wars that combine peace and war and where the battlefield is shifting, deception and deterrence became the major languages and the major kind of strategies, right? So what's more important is what this uncertainty where we all get waiting for something, waiting for a potential explosion or something else. It's not just, I'm sitting in my comfy chair and I'm just very uncertain about whether it happens or not. When with Ася Bazdreva we speak about labor of witnessing, we have to admit with this very laborious component of all this, let's say, mental stages or waiting or perception of events. These things that just wear you out. You can be very close to the battlefield or you can be far, you have your parents there, etc. And we know that it reaches you. One of the most difficult things for me after the invasion was the Kakhovka dump explosion. So I had almost nervous breakdown in Germany. I was amazed. I was thinking a lot about this, right? So how did it touch me so powerfully? But it reached me easily. I spoke to many people, specifically the explosion of Kakhovka dump reached many, many people in Ukraine and outside Ukraine. So this is also part of this war, how it takes all your energy, how it makes you go to psychiatric hospital, etc. What happens to you at this moment? It's crazy. And we need to understand that martial assemblages surround you whenever you are, right? So they crawl into your reality, they substitute your life-supporting assemblages, and you're suddenly worn out. So I think we need really consider this type of labor, the labor of relation, right? So as soon as you are related to this, you are engaged, and this war is working on you, against you, and engages you. But since we're already talking about Kakhovka, I think it's another huge thing. And if I may ask you guys questions, so what happened? What do you think about that event of this war? What is it for you?
I actually do feel what you say about the labor of being connected. And for me, it happened on the 3rd of March, when 8 bombs fell onto my street in Chernihiv. And a lot of people died there, and several people who I knew. It's like the scenery is mental landscape that is somehow your past, your childhood, your life somehow gets destroyed. There was bombing of actually the apothecary. I never knew that this building was so important to me. I've never been to Nova Kakhovka. I've never been to Kherson even. But my friend had a friend from Kakhovka. Nova Kakhovka at that time was occupied, and she asked me to help her friends to escape. And as I helped their family, and they gave my contact to their neighbors. So by this time, I know like a lot of people from Nova Kakhovka, and we all agreed that one day I will come there and they will show it to me. And then I feel like just the place suddenly stops existing. And it's not some landscape of the past or my past, but it actually was some kind of, if I could say something happy, a future.
A future, yeah, that was a future possibility for solidarity.
I didn't know even how to put into words, and I was thinking about the friend who actually lost her home several times, once when Kakhovka was occupied, then when she was forced to leave Kakhovka. She lived under occupation for 2 or 3 months there. And then the third time when Kakhovka was flooded. I never knew that you can lose something like 3 times, you know? I mean, you understand a lot of ways to connect with the place. It's not only mental, it's something different. Also, of course, I was thinking about the pollution itself and the damages. And here we wanted to talk about the pollution as a weapon of war and the temporal dimension of this pollution, cadaveric poisoning of waters from the bodies of people on the occupied part who were not like able to evacuate themselves, and cadaveric poisoning from the bodies of animals who wasn't able to leave. It's difficult to talk about that in some, I don't know, civilized way. I just don't know. I don't have this in me. Maybe right now, maybe I won't have it ever. So you just asked what I think about it. I was really angry, and I decided for myself that we organized a demonstration in Berlin against ecocide of Ukraine, and started at the same day to collect money for people who need it in Kherson. But it was like something, like on the personal level, it was, I don't know, some way to feel any subjectivity at all.
Yeah, I think Kakhovka had a huge impact. I tried to think more about that, but events like this, along with so many other hits, destruction, death, etc., they also show what such subjectivity is. It's not about you. It's suddenly all outside, right? So it's just like in psychoanalysis, Lacan used to say the unconscious is outside, what subjectivity is outside. So suddenly what all these spaces and landscapes and people and connections are your subjectivity suddenly, right? So something that you build, cherish, etc., sometimes consciously or unconsciously. And that's why we feel so like nothing. The more of all these outside elements of your subjectivity are touched, hurt, tortured, or demolished, the lesser of you is left. Because in the end, you are just little mechanics of life, and everything that constitutes you is outside. And this outside is destroyed. That is also one of the inventions of the 20th century and modernity. And when we read Sloterdijk, and when he reminds us to think war environmentally, it's not just about pollution. It's actually about that outside subjectivity. You can be killed by killing your environment. You can be actually made into nothing if your environment is correctly destroyed. If someone would knew what actually to destroy out of your environment, and sometimes it's not so many objects. If someone really knows where your subjectivity is invested, what are your objects, right? So you can be just made nothing, and you would never recover. And that is why all those hits on museums and libraries, etc., because, of course, among many other seemingly non-significant objects that constitute our subjectivity, there are some objects of a higher significance that somehow almost automatically we are attached, even if we've never been there, like that house of Raiko, naive artist that went underwater. I knew it existed. I never been there, but just like Maria Primachenko, her work also incredibly interests me, and the fact that this object, artifact, exists there. I've never been there, but I was something because of it, because I knew it was there, right? So somehow something about me was invested in that future somewhere there. So I'm a subject because all of it. And so the fact that this place vanished my subjectivity is hurt or maybe destroyed at a certain point. And with the destruction of libraries, museums, landscapes, reservoirs, or something else, they all have to do, and especially recently, right? So when we speak more and more over recent years with this new ecological awareness, we construct and we build, and our subjectivity emerges not only attached to cultural objects or objects of sentimental memory, it attaches to fields and forests, right? So we started thinking of ourselves as with these environmental beings. And again, back to Sloterdijk, when we think about ecologized wars or thinking war environmentally, it means not only poisoning something and weaponizing actual chemicals, it's also about killing you as a subject, because this field makes you something, even if you have never been there, but it in a certain way constitutes you too, along with many other things. And that's what I really learning in this extremely painful way during this war. This pain comes from the destruction of quote-unquote culturally significant but also culturally insignificant objects. And we are speaking about such things, right? So we are not even speaking about blood and sweat of soldiers, which is entirely unbearable and horrible topic, especially this knowledge that recently becomes so clear that not so many people left, and there are still so many people in the Russian Federation, and we are running out of people. If we go back to Kakhovka, there is some theme that lives with me for the last couple of months. On the top of the significance of that tragic event of ecocide, and also the fact that ecocide is genocide and genocide is ecocide, it also has a longer history that is incredibly interesting and very problematic. And it has to do with, again, in colonialism and imperialism and whatnot. Obviously, you probably also saw some people speaking about the history of building Kakhovka station and all sort of controversies attached to this and whatnot. And this is not my thought. I heard some of it from Ukrainian literature scholar Vіра Агеєва, who very long time ago was my master thesis director, right? So she was my teacher until I escaped Ukraine in 2004. And Vira Agеєва became an incredible reader of Ukrainian literature, the way she understands the text of Ukrainian literature. Nobody does today. And the things that she takes and what she emphasizes in text, what she observes, what she notices, has so deep and profound meaning about this whole relation between Russia and Ukraine. And so I really encourage, go to her text. And so anyway, I was listening in one of the conversations with her online recently, and she mentioned something that was just so in my mind, but she articulated it so well, and I decided to think more about this and research. And what she said was about the other side of this explosion, of this catastrophe. The other side has to do with this painful history of industrialization and how the water reservoir, the sea, Dovzhenko wrote, and there is this film, obviously, the poem about the sea, the celebration of creation of the sea, the water reservoir. But what she said, and the way how she said it, was that a huge part of Ukrainian steppe was stolen. So the ecocide happened then. So you're probably familiar with some of my thinking about the Chernobyl disaster, when I also say like the zone wasn't even created in 1986, it was created when the Duga radar and the power plant were built in the 70s. So when we think about this ecocide happened not just with this explosion, this ecocide happened then. It's just a kind of almost the same thing, right? So this is a theft of a Ukrainian steppe. And suddenly we have this steppe returned. And sometimes when you think about Anthropocene, about what Vernadsky called noosphere as a force, as a thought and technology and war all together as a force of nature. Just like when we think about Anthropocene, when a human being is thought as a force of nature. But in noosphere, for Vernadsky, it was technology, human thought, industry, all of this all together was that force of nature. And you are mourning the disappearance of that steppe, and suddenly 100 years later this anthropocentric force of nature returns you this step back in this horrific event of explosion. And so sometimes when I think about all these forces and powers and colonialism as logic that operates within this horrific return of the steppe. And also, when I spoke with some experts and Ukrainian scientists who knew more about the state of pollution in that water, they're very reluctant to talk about this. And just many of them simply say, well, next time we will do better. Because, in fact, there was poison there accumulating since the beginning. It was a place of poison. It was extremely polluted, like gnila rana, a rotten wound of colonialism in a certain way. And then this rotten wound just explodes. And you never know what is the worst part of the story. Right? At the moment you think that's what explosion now, but then you realize that every step of the story is the worst. So, and that's why I got completely sick when it happened. And then suddenly I decided to hurt myself even more, thinking about the long story. And why nobody, including me, paid attention. Because in the end it comes to us, right? So we are speaking about things, but it's not about someone didn't do something. We didn't do it. I didn't write about this. You didn't think about it, right? So we didn't. So why we come back to those things when something explodes? When war erupts, right? So how do we notice things without these catastrophes? And what I'm saying, it's already too late, because I'm saying it in the context of the war, where it seems like all your attention has to go there, because this is a struggle now, especially when your future is constantly destroyed. I still want to think about the future and learn something even in the midst of this horrific situation, and think about, so how to do things, or what should be done in the future, in that time of the after the war. At the moment when your future is being destroyed, you build future by setting new tasks. You're kind of substituting the losses by new tasks.
Yeah, I wanted to add some things about Kakhovka. I had mostly two reactions, and one was connected to impossibility of this, because I couldn't believe that the scale of these impossible things are continue to grow, and this was another level of impossible which is actually happening. But from another side, I was thinking about the people who were involved in this process and the set of the actions which should happen to make this possible, actually. So I was trying to understand, of course I couldn't, this colonial logic and the personal also choices of people who were involved, because it's quite a process of technologies and set of actions, yes. Also because I saw the video when two Russian soldiers talking about the house floating in the river and making jokes about this, because it also I was trying to understand them, but it was also impossible things. But I was also trying to understand the whole colonial logic we're talking about, because it really inherit this level of making impossible things in terms of survival, environment, and I don't know, just life possible. And how this idea of the level of acceptable pollution, for example, is inherited in colonialism, or the way of thinking of lands and people as resources, or labor forces, or economic resources again. And like coming from Uzbekistan, I was also researching information on Aral Sea, and I'm hoping to see it soon, like what was left from the sea, and how it also was possible. And I was watching a documentary film of people who stayed there even when the sea had left, and they kind of stuck in this no time, in this waiting for sea to come back. So colonialism also stole from them the time itself. They are not living, but they are just waiting for something which can never happen in their lifetime. I feel kind of responsibility to still try to understand how it works on different levels, like this colonial logic, and people who are involved, I don't know, like why they accept this, and what mechanism works to make this violence acceptable for them, and how it's still going on, and what mechanism in this particular war Russia uses to make all this what happening acceptable for people in there, and especially for people who are involved in doing these things. Because I think probably without attempts to understand how it works, we cannot do something with it. But I was also thinking about the weaknesses of these colonial ways of thinking, because they still remain insensitive to something. They see resistance as something impossible. They see survival as something impossible. Or like these political strategies of keeping dignity, memory, culture, languages, impossible and weak for colonial logic, because it doesn't count it as something actually strong and important, but it is. And I was also thinking about Ichkeria, for example, and the resistance which is going like for 400 years actually, and it is still alive.
I almost feel like what Lilia said was just a so fantastic ending for the conversation. I just viscerally felt it. It was just wrapped up suddenly. I don't want to say anything after that.
Thank you for listening to this episode. Our guest today was Svitlana Matviyenko, and the moderators were Yivha Zban and Lilia Yuldasheva. If you want to reach us and share your thoughts on the episode, please email us at bidamedia@proton.me.